But surprisingly, and I see this happen a lot in very toxic work environments, where it's just more of a kind of a top down, this is what you need to do. This is the problem. You're the problem. They take a very aggressive approach in a very negative way. And people tend to shut down in response to that. And if they don't shut down, then they're going to go into fight mode and they're going to, fight back a bit, not necessarily physically, but verbally, or, certainly be in a little more of aggressive manner. And once someone's in that fight or flight mode, or they go into a mobilization mode where they're shutting down, you're not going to get through to that individual. You're not going to have a true dialogue. You're not going to have a good conversation.
I create clear thinking and decisive leaders who can amplify their influence. Contact me to find out how I can help you or your organization. And today we are blessed with two guests. We have Dr. Geoffrey Vanderpal and Dr. Randy Brazie. How are you guys doing?
We're doing pretty well today. How are you doing?
Doing all right, actually. And I am super excited to be talking about this stuff. And I can see Geoffrey nodding away. So I'm going to ask Geoffrey first. Geoffrey, tell me something strange about you.
Something strange about me? Well, I guess a little known fact, I was elected as the youngest municipal official in state history when I was 19 years old.
That is cool.
Yeah.
I like that. Randy, shall I ask you something different? Because that's hard to beat.
Right. Well, I was, if you know where to look, I was actually an extra on the HBO miniseries 6 Feet Under. And and if you catch me, I'm wearing black spandex and leather at a swingers party in the scene.
You guys live way too much interesting lives. It's just not fair. That is so cool. All right, then. So tell me a little bit more about what you do. Either one of you.
Well, Neuro Consulting was founded on the premise of using the latest neuroscience and ideas from neuroscience and applying it to leadership and better business decision making. In fact, it's kind of an interesting story at how this got started. Randy and I have been friends for years, and one night a few years ago, we were having dinner, and I've always had an interest in psychology and psychiatry, and I was asking him questions about what he was doing and what he was focusing on, and so he was talking about PTSD and trauma and stress, things like that, and studying somatic experiencing. And I thought, well, what is that? What does that mean? And he started talking about polyvagal theory and some of these other ideas of neuroception and interoception, all these ideas and concepts that went into that. I was just fascinated by it. And the more we engaged in a conversation about it, the more I realized, this has application in leadership models, business decision-making. I have not seen this anywhere in the literature and the work that I've done at the university level. And I thought it was fascinating. I said, maybe we can collaborate and maybe take these two different disciplines and put them together to come up with something, great from that. And that's how this all really got started.
I think that's cool, actually. I don't think we do enough about the neuroscience when we're talking about leadership. I know, like in my work, when I'm either mentoring or training or whatever, I do a lot about neuroscience and hacking the brain and how you can make it work for you. But it's something that isn't really focused on, and I think that's such a loss.
Yeah. It's a fascinating area.
Yeah.
And a lot of ideas, the genesis of our book, The Steadfast Leader, multiple peer-reviewed research articles, now working on a second book that's currently being looked at by publishers. It's focused more in the healthcare industry. But, all of this is really the genesis from that initial conversation and trying to take these different disciplines and put them together. But it's been a fascinating journey.
I bet. So, Randy, what on earth is the polyvagal theory?
Yes, that's a good question, right? So what is this thing that we're using? And, it really gets to this point that you two were discussing is that traditionally in the business world, there's been a heavy focus on organizational psychology, basically what they call the cognitive models of psychology. And those are important. They have contributed massive amounts of useful information, but it's also just half of the puzzle. It's almost as if, those of us in psychiatry and psychology forgot that we have more primitive parts to our brain that are what what we call the nonverbal brain, right? These are parts of your brain that actually don't understand language or thinking. And that's why they're so hard to control. It's like, is there a reason why you can't put that biscuit down? Well, maybe because your limbic system is telling you, I want to eat that biscuit. It's not your thinking brain. So polyvagal theory then really stemmed from this. And the founder of it is a scientist named Stephen Porges, who is a psychologist and a neuroscientist. And he originally was doing research on heart rate variability in fetuses and newborns. And basically, the very short version of the long story is that he discovered that the vagus nerve, which is one of our 10 cranial nerves that originate from the brain, very, very is heavily influenced in how we respond to stress. And using his theory, those of us in the mental health world really started to learn that when we go through a lot of stress, when we're exposed to, scary events, traumatic events, overwhelming events, that this fight or flight response, right? You hear about this, that we go into fight or flight, or sympathetic nervous system, that it's the vagus nerve that really tries to turn off the fight or flight response. But it also, so meaning going back to like, hey, everything's okay. But the vagus nerve also has a different branch that will put us into shutdown. And it's what Porges calls immobilization. And so, but our nervous system makes this determination of which state we go into based on its own automatic processing of what's going on around us. It doesn't go through your thinking brain. It then alerts the thinking brain. So he uses the term polyvagal because the vagus nerve has more than one main branch. Poly means more than one. And he's the one that really discovered this connection. When I was in medical school, they used to think the vagus nerve is all about rest and digest. It's about chilling, relaxing, and enjoying one's life. But it's also this immobilization state where you just freeze and shut down, what we call in mental health dissociation, which is pretty common in severe trauma. So that kind of in a nutshell, and it talks about that our brains scan for safety or danger, and that we vary between these different states of everything's cool to fight or flight with the sympathetic nervous system, which is a different branch, or our shutdown. And we vary based on our brains deciding where we think we're at as far as risk or safety at the moment.
All right. Okay. So thank you for that. So I'm now wondering whether autistic shutdown is controlled by the vagal nerve, or is that something else?
That's a good question. You could say that usually when we talk about if it's mediated by the vagal nerve, this is where a person is withdrawn socially. They are not really connected with others. They can't. They may not even be connected with their own thinking, their own creativity.
So it could be then.
They look, by all purposes, they look like they're functioning and normal and breathing and moving around, but there's a disconnect, right? There's a disconnect state. Yeah. And they actually have shown that this is a portion of your brain called the insular cortex, and it connects the verbal and the nonverbal parts. It actually kind of shuts off when we're in shutdown state. And so, like I said, we look like we're doing okay, but we're actually kind of disconnected.
No, I've seen that. I've seen that with autistic people where there's that complete shutdown, and you can see it in the face because everything is like all the muscles are slack. I wouldn't say they're relaxed, it's slack. It's just there. So Geoffrey, how do you switch it back on? Or is that, can we do something to turn it back on again? Or
between the different states?
Yeah, because like if someone's in shutdown, it's not obviously just autistic. Other people go through various elements of shutdown, although it can be more dramatic in, say, in an autistic person. Is there a way of stopping that shutdown?
Well, I can't speak to autism, and that's not my area.
But just generally
speaking. From a business perspective, a leadership perspective,
yeah.
If you're looking at it from a leadership perspective and dealing with people versus being the person that's affected and them shutting down, there's two different perspectives on this. I'll let Randy answer more of the topic regarding, if it's the employee or a peer who's shutting down in those different states, because he can talk a little more about the science behind that. But from a leadership perspective, managing people, being able to recognize these different states and how to deal with those different states are critically important. And that's how you can more effectively manage people and manage the environment around you. But also managing yourself and being self-aware of why you're responding to the environment the way that you are to certain stimuli or situations is really important and key. And most of us think we're aware, but we really don't take a step back to truly analyze in most cases why we feel or think or respond the way that we do. We just respond without really thinking about it. And that's something that people commonly do. And so there are techniques and things that Randy can talk about in a little more detail regarding that. But basically, being able to recognize those different states, both in yourself and others, is critically important. So you can make decisions and respond in a more positive or certainly a more effective way to the environment around you, and also make better decisions for yourself as well.
I guess what you're saying, or what's bringing it up for me, is thinking that we are being hijacked by biology on a subconscious level. But if we get cognitive about it, then we can release that hostage situation. If we actually sit there and reflect and go, okay, why did I do this? Maybe we can not quite outthink it, but it's that body-mind connection, isn't it? So we could, by the awareness of thinking it through, we can take different behaviors, which will change how the biology works with us. Is that right?
Yeah, actually, you bring up a very salient point, Judith, is that it's the image that was taught to me as a student it's like, imagine the mouse riding the elephant. The mouse is your cognitive brain and the elephant is your instinctive primitive brain and drives. And it shows you the power differential. And so we have gone through life thinking we can control everything just with the cognitive brain. And it gives us quite a bit of control. But how do you work with these more primitive drives? This is why people struggle with things like, why can't I exercise or lose weight or stop procrastinating, right? A lot of this comes from more deeper levels, as well as also from the thinking part of the brain. So, to kind of riff off of what Geoffrey was talking, to build upon that, really ultimately what polyvagal theory says is that you want the brain to return to automatically thinking that things are safe and that it's okay to connect. Because when we're all stressed out, we tend to think things aren't safe, so we have to run or fight or shut down. But we have to get ourselves out of that state. And this gets really to what Geoffrey was talking about, that we need to be able to know ourselves. Where am I at this particular moment? What state am I in? And then what we do is part of our book and part of our training that we offer is teaching people the skills on how to be able to navigate their own system, to get themselves into the state that they want to be. And that can be anything from very simple regulation exercises that are kind of mindful based, or, to exercise, or to learning some concepts and skills, to be mindful about how they communicate with others, or what the physical layout of their office or their home space is like. And so all these different things can have an impact on the brain. To get to your point on autism, one of the things that Dr. Porges developed is a protocol called the Safe and Sound Protocol. And what he did is he started working with researchers to modify sound so that you take all the frequencies out that would be associated with danger to your brain. Think about like real heavy vibrating sounds, which would sound like a predator, like a big tiger or
Jaws.
Or Jaws, something, coming to get you, right? So what they did, interestingly, is when they play this stuff over earphones, over the headphones, but over the ears. What they did is they found that kids with autism started to be more socially engaged and curious about connecting with others. And kids with ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, were calmer and more able to focus. So that's how you start to turn the insular cortex back on, is through different regulation skills or tools to help the person to settle, to feel safe, and to reconnect.
I'm liking this conversation. I'm finding it fascinating. Let's listen to a quick advert.
The Maverick Paradox. Judith Germain is an author, speaker, consultant, mentor, and trainer, and the leading authority on Maverick leadership. She is the founder of the Maverick Paradox, which supports organizations to enhance their leadership capabilities and to help business owners develop and grow their businesses. Judith enables individuals, business owners, and organizations to improve their impact and influence. She is also HR Zone's leadership columnist, and her expert opinion has appeared in national, international, and trade press.
Welcome back to the Maverick Paradox. This is the podcast for the pathologically curious. So I'd really like then to look into regulation, because I think a lot of poor leaders, what makes up the fact that they can be poor leaders is that they don't know how to regulate their moods, or they are not seeing the other person and the struggle that person has, so they end up winding up the issue rather than allowing that person to self-regulate and calm down. So, and I see that you guys look at it from different perspectives. So if I talk to you, Geoffrey, as a business leader, what can you do to help yourself regulate?
Well, I'll give you some examples to consider. So, if let's say you're managing an individual, managing a group, and you're having an issue with one of your team members, recognizing the state that team member is in is going to be important. So if you need to have a serious conversation with that team member, maybe it's a performance issue or something that might consider a little more sensitive, you want to make sure that team member is in a calm, engaging state, not putting them into a fight or bringing them in as if they're in a fight or flight state or immobilization where they're basically shutting down. Because in those states, it's not going to be effective to really have a conversation with that individual at that point in time. You may be better off saying, look, we can talk about this later, no problem, and just reschedule it. But you want to make sure that you're handling it in a way where you're opening up dialogue, you're listening to the individual. And this sounds like common sense, but surprisingly, and I see this happen a lot in very toxic work environments, where it's just more of a kind of a top-down, this is what you need to do, this is the problem, you're the problem. They take a very aggressive approach in a very negative way. And people tend to shut down in response to that. And if they don't shut down, then they're going to go into fight mode and they're going to, fight back a bit, not necessarily physically, but verbally, or, certainly be in a little more of aggressive manner. And once someone's in that fight or flight mode, or they go into a mobilization mode where they're shutting down, you're not going to get through to that individual. You're not going to have a true dialogue. You're not going to have a good conversation. So as that leader, you need to make sure that being able to recognize the state of that individual's in as you're talking to them, and B, making sure you don't put them into one of those states that is not the best state to be in. You want to see if you can move them into more of a calm, accepting state where you can have a dialogue, have a conversation, and that takes some time to build those skills and ability if you don't have that already. But it can be done. Anyone can learn those skills to be able to do that. It's not a magic trick. It's just simply learning how to talk to people in a way that engages them and doesn't put them in a defensive posture or in a way that's very toxic or negative that puts them into one of those lower levels of we call the Polyvagal ladder, which we don't want them going into. That could be a real problem. So that's really for leadership. That's what's most important, is being able to recognize those states and how to deal with those states. But then also recognizing your own state of mind.
Just about to say about that, yeah. Because that's the bit people forget, isn't it? It's like, it doesn't matter. You can't do the right thing to someone and yet be the wrong thing yourself. It's not possible.
Right.
Yeah, so I'm glad you said that. Yeah. Okay, then. So over to Randy then. So what about the other side of it then? So we looked at as what a business leader. What about that individual that, I don't know, is triggered by the mere sight of their boss triggers them into getting angry?
Well, that's the key. And that kind of gets to, what we were talking about just a couple minutes ago, is this, know thyself, right? You as a person would really benefit from learning, where am I on that particular moment on the ladder? So Deb Dana is a very famous therapist in the United States who created the polyvagal ladder as just a nice visual way to look at understanding one of those three states, right? So everything's fine. I'm in social engagement, to fight or flight. That's our sympathetic nervous system, to that shutdown, the immobilization that Geoffrey talked about. And that we go up and down the ladder. So we first have to know, where am I? What are the signs of when I'm in one of these three states? What does that look like for me? And also, what does that mean about my assumptions about the world? So, when I see my boss, my heart starts pounding, I get sweaty and I start to shake. I must be in sympathetic fight or flight. And when I'm in that state, I feel like the world, it just feels very overwhelming. Like my boss, I just want my boss to go away, or I want to get out of here. So that's the first step, is knowing thyself. And then from there, when a person's much more aware, and that really ties into theories around mindfulness, right? That the more you know about where you're at a particular moment in time, that gives you more choice points about what to do about it. And so then by learning and using regulation skills or techniques, now I can do something. Oh, I'm in fight or flight. I know that I could do this, or this. I could, stare at the trees outside. I could orient to what's around me, or I could try to notice sensations in my body. You can start to shift your own system so that it's not that I'm expecting my boss to change per se, but I can do something about myself to regulate my own nervous system. Then that person's going to feel much more confident and much more settled and able to kind of roll with it. Therefore, they have more what we call resilience in their nervous system.
Makes sense. It reminded me of many years ago, I was head of HR and I had a member of staff that would trigger me. And I was triggered because they were always hyper excessive when something happened. And obviously in HR, there's always something happening. And they'd be like, oh, Jude. And it got to the point that the mere sight of this individual, my heart would start racing. And I sat in the room and I said, okay, we need to do something about this, because every time I see you, my heart starts to race. And this is because when you're interacting with me, like unpicked it, when you interact with me, you're always overly excited about something that tends nuts. Let's work on doing that. So we worked on reducing that, and which was great for me because I no longer had, a racing heart every time they turned up into the room. So it was beneficial for both of us, but I think it was good for her to understand how she was interacting with others and the impact it was having. Because I was saying to her, I can see the impact and I can work around it because I'm aware of it. And I have, like, as you say, the strategies to not go completely stressed out. But other people or employees even, which is even more important, would have different, you're meant to go to HR and be calmed, not stressed out because they're hyper excited about something. So that reminded me of that as a real example of being aware of being triggered. It was just all biology. And I know when I work with people, I said, how do you frame your stuff? I do a lot of public speaking, but when my heart starts racing and I get a queasy stomach, my frame is I'm super excited. I care about this is going to be awesome. And I'm just pumped up. And in fact, if I don't feel it, I'm like, do I not care enough about this thing? What can I do so I can feel butterflies? Whereas I know other people would read it as, because the mind, it's just biology, isn't it? What you put on it is how the mind is going to react to it, isn't it? So I'm not nervous. I see it as nervous excitement, or this is going to be great, or I'm really hyped up about it, rather than, oh my gosh, I'm so anxious I can't do it.
Well, you actually hit upon an important point is that one of the things that Steve Porges talks about is that actually we often are in a blend of these different states. So that if you were getting ready to do a public speech, or if you're actually going to go and play some sports, or maybe you're going to perform, you actually want to have some sympathetic nervous system energy, because that's part of play. That's part of performance. And so you don't want to be in shutdown during that. And so you need a bit of that energy.
You'll get hit by the ball, wouldn't you? That wouldn't be so good.
Yeah.
So Geoffrey, tell me about Steadfast Leader.
Well, Steadfast Leader is a collaboration between Randy and I. So a couple of years ago, we started writing the book. And that is quite unique because it's the first book of its kind to integrate polyvagal theory with leadership and leadership models. But we we go deeper than that. We talk about behavioral finance a bit. We talk about HR issues. We touch on some other areas as well, and a little bit in project management. But basically, we carry through the book a character, Oliver Green, share stories and examples along the way of actual professional situations one might run into and how to use some of the techniques and ideas that we present to better manage those circumstances. And here's an example I think you'll appreciate, Judith, being from HR. So imagine you're in a situation where you're interviewing a candidate for a position. And on paper, they're their ideal candidate. They've got all the education, the right credentials, experience, etc. And by all accounts, they would be a perfect fit for the organization. But as you're interviewing them, there's something about them that you just don't like. Something kind of sets you off. You have an uneasy feeling. You're not feeling good about this person. But the thing is, though, it may not actually be that individual's fault. So imagine being mindful of your own circumstances, taking a step back and asking, why am I feeling this way with this individual? Because they seem like a nice person. They check all the boxes. This could be a great candidate for the position. And as you're being more mindful and thinking about, why am I responding in this way? Why do I feel this way? What's causing these internal feelings as I'm interviewing this person? You realize that there was a past traumatic experience. Maybe it was someone you knew years ago that this person reminds you of. Maybe it's some facial features. Maybe it's the hairstyle. Maybe it's the voice, some characteristics, whatever it is, reminds you of that individual that you had a fairly traumatic or negative experience with. And now you're associating that with this person sitting in front of you. This is a completely different person. They had nothing to do with your past trauma. Now, most people probably wouldn't recognize that, and they would go ahead and just move on to another candidate. But being able to be mindful of, why am I feeling this way, and being able to recognize it and deal with it in a healthy way, now you may have realized what's happening, but also you may end up hiring that individual, realizing that this is actually a perfect candidate for the position. The problem is not the candidate. The problem is me and how I'm responding to that environment or that stimulus, and being mindful of that. So we talk about techniques and things of that nature in the book that can help in many different ways in business, including the hiring process as well. And I think that's really important because we see a lot of that in the business world.
I think that's fascinating. Thank you for that. And I'm just wondering, it's one thing to say, be mindful and aware that the way you're reacting, if you're somebody who spends a lot of time reflecting and being aware of what you're acting, because it's just like breathing, right? You're just like, oh, I'm feeling really stressed out with that person. Why is that? It's just a natural, something that the three of us would just do without thinking about it. But for those that this is like new, how can they just do that? Is there any sort of skills or techniques that they can deploy?
Well, that would, really be about the regulation skills. So as we talked about, first step, know thyself, learn the ladder. Where am I on the ladder? What shifts me? The other part of the ladder is what shifts me from one state to another. And then the final part that you learn is what helps me get out of that state and into the state that I want to be in. And this is where people have to do a little bit of homework and take some time to really write down, jot down. And Deb Dana has, worksheets that have the ladder on it, and then people can jot. But you don't really need to have to do that. You can also just write in a journal or type, in a Word document. What are the things that help shift me that I can do by myself? What are the things that help shift me that I can do with others? So they have to kind of start building their own list. It's like your own playlist of skills. In addition, some of the self-regulation skills would be simple things like mindful sitting, mindful walking. We go through a bit of that. Borrowing from somatic experiencing, which is another field that I've done some training in, is orienting. When an animal is just looking around and checking out its environment, that's an animal that's not under threat. The old deer in the headlights, as we say, where you freeze and look at the potential threat. But if you're just kind of casually checking things out, it means in a backwards way, you're training your brain to say, oh, everything's fine. There's no danger here. So there are actually some very simple skills that people can learn. Breathing techniques, right? People talk about that all the time. There's certain ways one can do breathing techniques to calm your nervous system. And there are some visualized ways that one can play with your breathing that can actually settle and calm your nervous system that are very subtle. Nobody will know you're doing it. So if people can start to learn that, they can shift themselves out of fight or flight, or they can shift themselves out of shutdown back into some movement and some activity. So it does take time and practice, just like you wouldn't go and be an Olympic skater immediately. You have to practice at it. But this is not as hard. You have much better odds at learning self-regulation skills than to becoming a gold medalist in the Olympics. So that's kind of in a nutshell the approaches that we recommend and discuss in our book.
Yeah, and I thank you for that. And I guess people would need to want to self-regulate, because I think there's comfort for some people not regulating. Or am I just being weird to say that?
It's interesting, the devil, right? So sometimes it's frightening or scary to change or to step outside of one's traditional way. Or it's hard to, break one's habits, to do things differently. It does take some effort and some will. So the person, would have to decide, I notice I'm stressed, or I'm just not happy, or I'm not getting where I want to in the workplace. Maybe these are some things that might be beneficial to me. Or at the very least, they're going to make me a happier, more productive person. And there's a lot of studies in the business world, that Geoffrey has contributed towards and pulled attention to, that show about engagement, connection, communication do make a difference. Don't they, Geoffrey, as far as productivity, retention, things like that?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, employee turnover, it's so high now, at least in the United States, we see such high employee turnover, and you see it in some other areas as well. It's a serious problem. And the cost, you look at the cost of employee turnover because of all the toxicity being created in some of these workplaces and the bad policies and how people respond to each other, interact with each other. It's profound. The average lower white collar worker, the average cost to cover turnover per employee per year is about $35,000. So if you're a large organization, you've got a 30-40% turnover rate, those numbers can get into the millions very quickly. And the thing is, though, management doesn't really recognize that as much because
I was
there's
about to say,
an accounting line item that says cost of turnover. It doesn't exist on the expense statement or the P&L. So because it's not really seen, you kind of know, okay, there's some expense here, but you don't really know or really see it on a continual basis. What is this actually costing the company? So they might buy less pencils to save money in office supplies, but the real cost is employee turnover. And that's not including lower productivity. That's just the cost of getting rid of an employee, hiring a new one, the ramp up period to get them to a certain level of productivity, and all the other costs. And plus, you're probably going to pay that new employee more money on top of it. So, for example, letting someone go because you don't give them a pay raise and they quit, you end up hiring someone else. You're going to pay them more anyways. You might as well give them that person, if they're a good employee who's producing a lot for the company, that pay raise in the first place, instead of saying no and then having to find someone new months later to replace them. It makes absolutely no sense. But we do this all the time. And the cost is aggregately, it's in the multiple hundreds of billions per year, but for companies can well into the millions. And that's something we really need to have more of a deeper discussion on.
Yeah, I think it's very short-sighted. I remember I worked in one particular company that no one was listening to the effects of poor leadership with a particular, when you've got that person that is seen as a great leader because they're in a fee-earning department. The fact that they're toxic and all the rest of it doesn't matter. And I worked out the management cost of that individual, i.e., did involve the harassment, bullying claims that they were generating, the increased absence, the turnover, and all that. And it was like, oh, yeah, I see, we need to do something. It was just like, because the moral argument wasn't strong enough, and even the loss of productivity wasn't strong enough because it was deemed that they would still be bringing in more money than the low-level people that were leaving. And it's like, yeah, but it doesn't affect just that one department, actually. It's affected, there's people in other departments leaving because of this one person. Do you know what I mean? It's just crazy.
Yeah. Well, at the end, you don't quit the company, you quit your boss.
Yeah, well, Clearly. And that's why I think people are struggling so much with remote work. Because what was the old adage? I hate my job, but I love the people I work with. Well, if you don't see the people you work with, then you're left with the I hate the job. Do you know what I mean? There's no mitigation to there's no community to go, well, so I think that in itself could be quite interesting. I could talk about this with you guys for ages, and actually I'd like you guys to come back and we can talk some more. I definitely think there should be a part 2 of this if you guys are up for that.
We'd be delighted. Yeah.
Appreciate that.
Cool. All right. So is there anything from either one of you that you feel, gosh, she's a complete idiot, she didn't even raise this point? Because if there is, then tell us and then answer it or conclude for today. Is there anything that we should have discussed?
Can't think of anything on my end. I think we covered, the science a bit and some explanations about it and how it could be applied. Anything on your end, Geoffrey, as far as the business
I
side?
think we covered quite a bit.
We did, and it was fun. So, Geoffrey, Randy, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you so much for inviting us, Judith.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
You're welcome. And thank you once again for tuning into the Maverick Paradox podcast. I'm Judith Germain, your host, and I hope you've enjoyed today's conversation.
The Maverick Paradox Magazine. The Maverick Paradox Magazine is for the pathologically curious. Written by a swagger of socialized mavericks who are divergent thinkers, the magazine tackles the biggest issues affecting maverick leaders today. You might be a business owner or a leader within an organization who wants to have your thinking challenged, to be exposed to a diversity of thought, or to learn from diverse experts in their fields. If so, the Maverick Paradox Magazine is for you. Join the swagger at themaverickparadox.com and engage in the conversation.